Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be starting in a short while. Do kindly be seated. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A reminder once again to get started and also to please switch your phones to silent mode.
Kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, bangunkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, semarakkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa. Kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, bangunkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, semarakkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat.
Please rise, announcing the arrival of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Yang Amat Berhormat Dato' Sri Anwar bin Ibrahim, accompanied by VIPs.
Madani. Bina asas kemampanan, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, bangunkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak berTV, semarakkan Malaysia madani. Sepenuh hati, jiwa, semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian dan jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat.
We would appreciate the media could make way.
Malaysia madani, ayo seluruh
We'd like the media to please make way for the Prime Minister. Please make way. I would like to invite the media to please make way for the Prime Minister. Please remain standing for the national anthem, Lagu Negaraku. Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar bin Ibrahim and all, please be seated.
Wow, what an energy-filled beginning. Good morning, everyone. I feel like this isn't quite the right way to greet you all. Hold on, let's do this properly.
Much better, thank you. Let's get started. Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar bin Ibrahim, Prime Minister of Malaysia. Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Dr. Ahmad Zahid bin Hamidi, Deputy Prime Minister. Yang Amat Berhormat Premier of Sarawak. Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy. Chief Secretary to the Government of Malaysia. Distinguished Menteri Besar dan Kedua Menteri. Their Excellencies, Ambassadors and Foreign Representatives, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Salam Malaysia Madani. Good morning and a happy 2025. Welcome to Forum Ekonomi Malaysia 2025 or FEM 2025. How apt to kick off the new year with this high-impact conversation platform to chart Malaysia's priorities and policies for 2025. Organized by the Government of Malaysia, anchored by the Ministry of Economy, this annual event will track the medium-term progress of the government's initiatives and set the narrative for the coming year. With Malaysia assuming the chairmanship of ASEAN in 2025, seizing Malaysia's moment recognizes the country's inherent strengths to seize the opportunities that lie ahead. Let's now welcome the Imam of Masjid Negara Al-Fadil, Ustaz Muhammad Nazri bin Mustaqim, for the opening prayer recitation.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Malaysia Madani. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Hamdan syakirin, hamdan hamidin. Hamdan yuafi ni'amah wa yukafi'u mazidah. Ya Rabbana lakal hamdu kama yanbaghi li jalali wajhika wa azimi sultanik. Ya Allah, Tuhan yang maha bijaksana, kami bersyukur atas rahmat dan nikmat yang tidak terhitung sehingga kami dapat berhimpun di Forum Ekonomi Malaysia 2025 yang bakal dirasmikan oleh Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar bin Ibrahim, Perdana Menteri Malaysia. Gunakanlah keberkatan kepada majlis ini agar membawa manfaat besar untuk pembangunan negara kami Malaysia. Ya Allah, jadikanlah perbincangan dalam forum ini sebagai titik tolak untuk memahami cabaran, mencari penyelesaian, menggubal strategi yang adil serta inklusif. Limpahkanlah hikmah dan petunjuk-Mu kepada para pemimpin, pakar dan peserta agar setiap keputusan selaras dengan kehendak-Mu dan membawa kebaikan untuk Malaysia. Ya Allah, kukuhkan kerjasama antara kami, baik di peringkat nasional maupun antara bangsa. Gunakanlah keberkatan dalam usaha ini, memajukan ekonomi yang mampan dan membina masyarakat sejahtera. Jauhkanlah kami dari penyelewengan, perpecahan dan sifat tamak yang amat merugikan bangsa dan negara. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina azaban nar. Sallallahu ala Muhammad walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Taqabbalallah.
Thank you, Ustaz Al-Fadil. I'd now like to invite up on stage Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, the Minister of Economy, for his welcome speech. A round of applause for the Minister.
Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, Prime Minister of Malaysia. Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Dr. Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, Deputy Prime Minister. Yang Berhormat Datuk Patinggi Tan Sri Dr. Abang Haji Abdul Rahman Zohari, Tun Datuk Abang Haji Uping, Premier of Sarawak. Ministers of the Cabinet of Malaysia, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Datuk Sri Syamsul Azri Abu Bakar, Chief Secretary to the Government. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Nur Azmi Dirun, Secretary General of the Ministry of Economy, corporate partners to the FEM, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning and thank you everyone for attending the inaugural Forum Ekonomi Malaysia or FEM. We are privileged to host an esteemed line of panelists for every session with diverse perspectives from ministers, industry leaders, academics, and thought leaders. This event would not have been possible without the tireless support from our principal partner, Maybank, and other strategic partners, CGS International Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia, and MBSB Bank. The purpose of today's forum is unlike any other, to have a central platform at the start of the year to present the economic direction for the year, to track policy progress openly and transparently, and to allow the most vibrant and engaging debates on where the country's economy is headed. Another less obvious purpose of the FEM is that Malaysia must increasingly take on a globalist approach to policy making. The global environment is changing, and it demands more deliberate thought and action from all actors. Increasingly so, as small, open, and non-aligned, or we like to call ourselves SONA countries like Malaysia, have to take a high-stake role in the world stage. In particular, the SONA countries of Southeast Asia will play a vital role as the region's profile, approach, and vision go against the global tide that is currently headed in the opposite direction. Malaysia and Southeast Asia must recognize the unique differentiations we possess to carve our own path in this defining decade. The first differentiation is our unique demographic and growth profile, both now and its projected state in the future. What is often repeated is the market size, that Southeast Asia's 655 million population will grow to become the fourth largest economy in the world. The details of this shift, however, are equally as interesting. In 5 years' time, the middle-class population will double from 2 decades ago to emerge as the supermajority in Southeast Asia, at 65% of the population. That means the Southeast Asian middle-class population will exceed the population size of the United States and the European Union, making the region a consumer powerhouse with a higher spending power and standard of living. Added to that is its youth and digital profile, as Southeast Asians will be younger, more entrepreneurial, and more digitally connected than other regions in the world, even when other regions are expected to contract or slow down. Southeast Asia is still predicted to grow at a healthy pace of 4 to 5% in the next decade. This demographic and growth profile, we are young, digital, and middle class, is a rare and exceptional one. It explains why AI infrastructure, renewables, and digital investments have been pouring into Malaysia for the past 2 years, and it will continue to prove healthy as the region captures its next phase of growth. Ladies and gentlemen, the main mode of growth for the region in the next decade, however, will continue to run against the global tide of protectionism and isolationism that is prevailing now. Southeast Asia is the most heavily traded region in the world, both within Southeast Asia and with other blocs. Southeast Asia started from open trade. It is how our civilizations, infrastructure, and livelihoods are built, and it will continue to rely on this mode of growth for the foreseeable future. The world could turn inward, change its rules, and demand choices and allegiances from smaller countries. But we cannot change the way we are. We are champions of free trade, advocates for cooperation, and allies for pluralism and engagement. If we adopt a development perspective to the economy, almost all major Southeast Asian countries belong at the growth stage that requires more and not less cooperation. For Southeast Asia to break out of its middle-income trap that traditionally rely on low-cost, low-value labor, we must adopt and develop innovation, and innovation requires open and collaborative cooperation with others. That means this defining decade will see Southeast Asia go against the global tide by continuously seeking cooperation and partnerships with traditional and non-traditional allies based on pragmatic win-win parameters so that Southeast Asia's growth is ensured. Lastly, in a world where politics is increasingly polarized and ideological, Southeast Asia's relative political and policy stability looks like an attractive standout. The world would have to contend with Southeast Asia's model that looks very different from what is out there, but has equal, if not higher, effectiveness in getting things done. Ladies and gentlemen, This is the critical landscape that Malaysia operates in. Our demographic and growth profile is unique compared to others. Our embrace of free trade and cooperation goes against the global tide, and our stable political and policy conditions are a standout from the rest. We are taking a globalist lens to policy making, culminating in the 13 Malaysia Plan that will be launched later this year. I hope today's forum opens up discussions with the same backdrop so that we could properly situate Malaysia to where it belongs in the world. Thank you very much for your time today. I would like to welcome all of you to the inaugural FEM 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, YB. For our plenary speech, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Chris Miller, and Dr. Miller is the author of Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. He's also Professor of International History, Fletcher School at Tufts University. Please put our hands together for Dr. Chris Miller.
Well, it's an honor to address this forum today and to have a chance to share with you some thoughts about how the world's semiconductor industry is changing and how Malaysia's role in the industry, already significant, might well grow. What I'd like to suggest is that the world is in the midst of a battle for the future of technology, and semiconductors, the chips that are in our phones and in our cars and in our computers and that are driving AI progress, are at the center of this struggle. If you ask yourself, what's driving advances in artificial intelligence? What's driving capabilities like ChatGPT? What you find is that the key impetus behind economic progress and technological development is not better software or better algorithms, it's better semiconductors. It's the advances in computing power that semiconductors have created that enable systems that can talk to us as if they're almost human. And as we begin to deploy artificial intelligence capabilities across all aspects of society, and transportation and education and healthcare and manufacturing will rely even more on advanced semiconductors to enable these capabilities. Which means that the ability to produce advanced chips like these ones, this is a GPU chip produced by NVIDIA, the type of chip that undergirds almost all of the world's leading AI systems, will be even more important in the future than semiconductors are today. And if you ask yourself how these semiconductors are made, well, they require the most advanced manufacturing that humans have ever undertaken, the ability to bring together billions and billions of microscopic components together in a way that can provide the computing that our world requires. Cutting-edge chips like the ones in your phone or in computers or the chips that make AI systems possible, they rely on ultra-complex manufacturing, supply chains that spread across the world. And it's only thanks to this international cooperation that it's possible to bring together the expertise in material science and computer programming and physics and chemistry that make this advanced nanoscale manufacturing possible. Supply chains that stretch from Europe to Asia, from North America to Southeast Asia. These global supply chains have been critical for making technological advances possible. They explain the growth of the world's largest technology companies. They've undergirded advances in both technology and the economic progress that comes for them for many decades now. And yet, as the minister before me mentioned, global supply chains are under unprecedented pressure. There's demands for protectionism coming from all of the world's major economies. Political leaders from China to the United States, from Europe to Japan, are pushing for policies that provide more protection for their industries. And even sectors of the economy that one would have thought were solely civilian in focus are increasingly impacted by security measures, which means that international supply chains are under more pressure today than at any point since the origins of our current era of globalization. Challenges that I think are inevitable given the political dynamics and the geopolitical dynamics that we see, but challenges that are very impactful on the technology sector in particular, because it's the technology sector above all that has benefited from the supply chains that stretch across all of the world's key regions. And for a country like Malaysia, which plays a pivotal role in many of these technology supply chains, but is a medium-sized country between larger economies that are trying to reshape the global economy in their interest, there are both opportunities and challenges that stem from this. It'll come as no surprise to any of you that the world's geopolitical landscape is fracturing. Just look at the headlines over the past couple of years and you'll see extraordinary changes today of the type that would have been highly unexpected several decades ago. The world's leading economies, the world's most powerful militaries are increasingly facing off against each other. In Europe and the Middle East, there are active wars underway, and in Asia, there's more tension today than there has been for many decades. And I think given this geopolitical dynamic, given the intensification of tensions in all of the world's key regions, tragic though it is, it's inevitable that this geopolitical tension will begin to impact economics. There's simply no way we can expect supply chains to be unimpacted when the world's largest economies are in a state of extraordinarily elevated tension. And indeed, in the technology sector and the semiconductor industry, the impact of geopolitics is today greater than it's been in a very long time. And that's present more in semiconductors and the artificial intelligence capabilities that chips enable than in any other segment of the world economy. Just look at the world's leading economies and the extent to which their political leaders have focused on semiconductors over the past several years. From the United States, where I live, to India, where I was just before I came to Malaysia, to Europe, to Japan, to China, all of the world's key leaders are focused on the semiconductor industry. They're trying to build their own capabilities, increase the position that they play in semiconductor supply chains, both because they want to increase their resilience in the face of potential shocks of the type that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, but shocks that could also emerge from political or geopolitical factors. And they also realize that advanced semiconductors, because they make possible artificial intelligence, will be key not just for the broad health of their manufacturing base, but also key to securing advances in AI. Because behind every new AI system are more and more advanced semiconductors, which is a key reason why all of the world's key economies are focused on chips in a way they have never been before. And it's not just the chips themselves, it's the computing capabilities that they enable, which are increasingly in focus. Many countries, China, India, key European countries, are targeting growth in computing power. The amount of aggregate compute that they have is a key national goal. And indeed, as the world's largest technology companies spend billions and billions of dollars building out their data center infrastructure, governments are not alone in thinking about computing capacity. The world's biggest companies are too. And if you want to build vast data centers and deploy the most advanced AI capabilities, you need the world's most sophisticated semiconductors inside them, which means behind every aspiration to build a country's computing capabilities is the question of accessing and developing the most advanced semiconductor capabilities. If you look at the distribution today of computing power, you'll find that the world's two largest economies are also the two largest in terms of deployment of computing capabilities. This chart shows you the number of servers installed by country. So the United States is far in the lead, China far ahead of the rest of the world in a number 2 position. And increasingly, political leaders and economic leaders alike are looking at charts like this as they project the growth of computing power into the future. And they ask themselves what are the capabilities they'll need as artificial intelligence is deployed more widely throughout their economies. But the supply chains that make these advanced AI capabilities possible are increasingly under pressure from the exact political trends that I outlined earlier. The advanced chips that make AI systems possible are increasingly restricted in terms of where they can be sold and where they can't be sold. The tools that make the most advanced chips also face restrictions, which have been intensifying over the past several years. The critical minerals that are used in advanced semiconductor manufacturing are themselves increasingly facing restrictions. All the way down the supply chain to the basic materials themselves, there's politicization at almost every level. And it's happening because in the chip industry, compared to most other industries, there's much more concentration of production. One company produces the lithography tools that make advanced chips possible. Taiwan's TSMC manufactures 99% of the GPU chips on which AI systems are trained. China has a comparable market share in the production of some of the raw materials that go into the chip industry. And this concentration in the industry makes it possible for individual countries to try to weaponize the role that they play in supply chains. A trend that is understandable from the perspective of those countries, but also seen as dangerous by other players who rely on the capabilities that these supply chains enable. And it all happens as access to computing is getting even more important when it comes to developing artificial intelligence systems. This chart shows you the amount of computing power that was used to train the most advanced AI system of its day over the past several decades. And you'll notice the vertical axis shows you orders of magnitude increase in the amount of computing power being used. This is what AI researchers call the scaling laws. The intuition is that if you want to build a better AI system, you need to build a bigger AI system, trained on more data, and therefore using more computing power to undertake that training. This trend, which has been durable over now many decades, explains why the world's largest technology companies are spending tens of billions of dollars constructing vast data center complexes focused solely on the training and the deployment of AI systems. And if you ask the world's leading technologists, or if you look at how they're investing, they all believe that these scaling dynamics will continue. That if you want to build the next generation AI system, you'll need an even larger base of computing with which to do it, which means you'll need even more of the advanced semiconductors that have made AI possible, which means you'll become even more reliant on the highly concentrated and increasingly politicized supply chains that undergird the semiconductor industry. This is why artificial intelligence requires advances in the semiconductor supply chain, because it needs to deploy more compute at an extraordinarily rapid growth rate. And it means that the politicization of supply chains that we've seen over the past several years is, I think, only likely to grow. Today, every product relies on dozens or even hundreds of chips. A typical car, for example, will often have 1,000 semiconductors inside. And as we begin to deploy AI in different segments of the economy, the need for smarter systems will only grow. Systems that can collect more data, can communicate more effectively with other types of systems, that can think increasingly on their own, which means that for every sector of the economy, access to the computing power that advanced chips provide will be increasingly important. 2 decades ago, it was possible to make a car with almost no semiconductors inside. Today, the component inside of autos that's growing most rapidly in terms of the quantity as well as in terms of the cost are the semiconductors inside them. And that's not unique to cars. That's true to almost every manufactured product of any value. Which means that the progress in the chip industry, known in the past as Moore's Law, which predicts that the computing capability of chips will double every couple of years, is more important than ever. But the change we've seen recently is that the types of computing capabilities that are increasing exponentially are not general purpose, they're specialized. Specialized chips used for individual use cases like artificial intelligence that are receiving the most investment from big tech firms like NVIDIA, which is specialized in special purpose chips solely for artificial intelligence. That's where the advances are happening most rapidly. And it's why the world's biggest technology companies are becoming chip designers themselves. Microsoft, Alibaba, Baidu, and Facebook, they're all designing their own chips, realizing that if they have chips that serve the exact purposes that they need, they'll be even more capable of running the artificial intelligence workloads they require. This specialization is a driver of progress, but it's also a factor that increases the influence and power in the hands of the largest technology companies who get access to higher quality, lower cost computing than the rest of the economy. And it's forcing companies to test the limits of physics and chemistry as they bring more computing capabilities together. This trend called advanced packaging is changing how the chip industry works. It's testing the limits of our ability to bring power into systems, dissipate heat away from them, reshaping the landscape about how chip technology advances. And all of this has huge implications for countries like Malaysia, which of course is far from a new player in the chip industry. It's already been half a century in which Malaysia has been a very important part of the multinational semiconductor supply chain that I outlined. It means that Malaysia has both real opportunities, but also, I think, extraordinary challenges that emerge from this supply chain shift. And to conclude, I'll put 3 ideas on the table for the implications for Malaysia. The first is that the geopolitical landscape, the fracturing of supply chains, the politicization of every segment of chip design and manufacturing will force Malaysian companies to think not only about the economics of supply chains, but also about the politics. Even in segments that might not have seemed sensitive in the past, are increasingly politicized today. Second, the packaging and assembly capabilities where Malaysia excels today are undergoing dramatic change, driven by the advanced packaging trends that I discussed. And every AI processor today depends on new packaging capabilities, which are going to reshape the packaging landscape. And third is specialized chip architectures grow in importance. And as the world's largest companies invest even more resources in designing specialized chips for individual purposes, the role of chip design will only grow. It's worth noting today the world's largest chip company, NVIDIA, only designs chips. It does no manufacturing, no packaging, no assembly, and it is the largest by market value by far. And I think this trend and increasing focus in chip design is also something that is relevant for Malaysia as it tries to diversify its position in chip supply chains and play an even larger role in the future than it does today. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the forum.
Thank you, Dr. Chris Miller, and he'll be with us a little later for the dialogue session. And now, for the keynote address, it is my honor to invite Yang Amat Berhormat Dato Sri Anwar bin Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, up on stage. A round of applause for the Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulil karim. Saudara Timbalan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Zahid Hamidi, Premier Muhammad Johari, Saudara Rafizi Ramli, Menteri Ekonomi dan Keluarga Kementerian, Menteri-Menteri, Menteri-Menteri besar dan Ketua Menteri yang ada, rakan-rakan yang saya muliakan. 2025 ini tahun bagi kita amat mencabar dan kita memulakan dengan dentuman yang agak kuat kerana dari segi wacana ekonomi kita ada forum ekonomi. Kita mulakan dengan umpamanya tingkatkan hubungan dan kerjasama dengan rakan-rakan jiran. Dengan Perdana Menteri Singapura, Lawrence Wong, kita luncurkan program raksasa pembinaan Johor Singapore Economic Zone yang menjadi juga fokus kekuatan bagi Johor Singapura dan persekitarannya. Sebentar lagi, Presiden Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto akan datang untuk kunjungan kerja sambil makan tengah hari dengan saya dan kemudian pulang kerana lawatan rasminya itu akhir bulan. Tapi yang pentingnya ialah kerana usaha kami untuk memastikan Indonesia, Malaysia bekerjasama mengangkat kekuatan ekonomi. Dan di antaranya ialah kerjasama dengan syarikat utama Indonesia dan khazanah dan syarikat utama di Malaysia, termasuk dalam bidang digital yang kita tekankan sebagai transformasi digital. Esok, Perdana Menteri Jepun Ishiba akan sampai ke Malaysia dan kita akan bicara beberapa isu pelaburan, perdagangan dan juga suatu rencana baru yang sangat kritikal dari segi peralihan tenaga atas ikhtiar Premier Sarawak Abang Jo sama Petros dan kerjasama Petronas, dan kita harap dalam perbincangan itu akan mencana menjadikan Malaysia, khususnya Sarawak, sebagai hub tenaga bagi rantau ini. Sebelum itu, sementara berehat beberapa hari di Langkawi, saya sempat bincang dengan Dr. Thaksin, mantan Perdana Menteri Thailand, yang akan membantu saya dalam kerja kepengurusian ASEAN untuk meningkatkan bidang kerjasama dengan Thailand, dengan negara yang dianggap Indo-China sebelum itu, termasuk dalam bidang-bidang seperti selain daripada yang disebut microchip, semiconductor, tetapi juga tentang blockchain yang menjadi juga suatu bidang atau aspek yang harus kita bukan sahaja terokai tetapi tangani sebagai satu kenyataan yang tidak boleh dirongkai. Sebab itu forum ekonomi seperti ini memberi ruang kepada kita. Seperti mana saya sering tekankan kepada KSN dan Sri Samsul Azri, mengingatkan jentera kita supaya fokus kita itu mencari helah dan jalan untuk mengangkat kekuatan ekonomi. Saya hanya sebut hal-hal yang agak baru ini terokai. Kerana kalau kita ketinggalan seperti kita dengar sebentar tadi, walaupun seperti mana industri semikonduktor di Pulau Pinang itu agak lama, tetapi kalau tidak sedia untuk meneroka bidang baru, kita akan ketinggalan. Dan kita harus ada banner kekuatan yang menyeluruh, yang saya katakan tadi, supaya kekuatan ini dapat membantu kita mengangkat semula. Beberapa hari lalu kita juga meluncurkan tahun melawat Malaysia. Kerana kepengurusian ASEAN ini hanya sebagai suatu kesempatan untuk kita membina kekuatan bersama rangkai ASEAN yang disinggung oleh saudara Rafizi sebentar tadi, tapi juga memanfaatkan negara kita bersama yang lain. Yang ini yang kita tekankan bersama dengan Perdana Menteri Singapura. Dia tidak lagi umpamanya menganggap kekuatannya harus di Malaysia dan yang lain itu hanya pinggiran, atau kekuatannya di Singapura, yang lainnya pinggiran, atau kekuatan di Thailand, yang lainnya pinggiran. Tapi tidak, mencari jalan dan kaedah dan ikhtiar untuk menyelesaikan, termasuk membincangkan isu-isu yang merumitkan kita, termasuk Myanmar. Kerana prasyarat utama untuk mengangkat kekuatan ekonomi juga keamanan, kestabilan politik, dasar yang jelas, dasar ekonomi yang dapat memangkit kekuatan melalui penglibatan sektor swasta dan kecekapan sektor awam. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, coming into 2025, we're seeing the tail end of a gripping hegemony, where the levers of economic power and domination have been in the hands of a select few, one that had characterized the world, or the world economic order, defined by the principles of political economy of the West and well manifested in the Bretton Woods and related institutions. But as the superpowers retreat from responsibilities towards economic isolationism, that was referred to, building walls of protectionism and isolationism, while still chanting the mantra of a rule-based world economic order, we are seeing a divergence opening. And that is the rare opportunity to recalibrate policy positions towards economic pluralism, cooperation across multilateral platforms, and decision infused with a moral conscience. Then the relevance of Forum Ekonomi Malaysia. So is this chairmanship of ASEAN coming at a very opportune and challenging moment, because Asia has become the center of the global economy, and ASEAN is projected to be the 4th largest economic bloc in the world. No, the lion's share of global growth will stem from a combination of ASEAN, India, and China, collaborating with the West, United States, and Europe, resulting in a burgeoning middle class and a growing influence over decision making. When we formed the government at the end of 2022, we sought economic legitimacy through political stability in a world where the latter is increasingly hard to come by. Thereafter, we rolled out a series of progressive economic policies in our growth narrative, the Ekonomi Madani, fiscal space, and people-centric initiatives, whilst being driven by the fervor of institutional reform. The economy has rebounded dramatically, alhamdulillah, and we are seeing an influx of strategic investments across the board, and impressively and substantially in renewables and AI infrastructure. A shifting world economic order and empowered ASEAN and a stable Malaysia means we are no longer satisfied with playing the spectator. We must therefore take up the mantle to chart the path forward in 3 leadership domains. And this is, of course, the critical issue of economic leadership by development role modeling. Politically driven fails to appreciate the nuances of a nation's development. So, encouraging purely market-led growth should not be seen as being incompatible with the implementation of a comprehensive social agenda that advances equity, which means we cannot marginalize communities, and ensure that policies should not exacerbate poverty. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, both are mutually reinforcing. A robust economic foundation is essential for sustainable growth, enabling increased revenue that expands fiscal space and then allows for greater investments in education, healthcare, and social mobility. It's interesting that when I responded to the question during the media conference in the presence of Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, the interest was, of course, the mega project HSR. And my response is, it's no longer the business of the government, because our focus should be education, research, healthcare, and basic infrastructure, including dealing with the issues of poverty and issues that are critical to the masses, affecting them annually, like the focus on projects that can deal with the issue or resolve partly the issue of annual flooding, which means more allocation for flood mitigation programs. Now, this is to my mind the foundation of Ekonomi Madani, humane economy for social justice, a concept that we have advocated for decades and reiterated in last year's Khazanah Megatrends Forum. Not dissimilar to the progressive capitalism of Professor Stiglitz, this is where governments are bold in setting rules, for example, on environmental protection, financial regulations, and others needed for the proper running of the economy to ensure that it works for all and not just for the few. In 2024, Malaysia successfully tamed inflation, reduced unemployment, and stabilized our currency. We have, thank you. But I must remind my colleagues, the cabinet members are here. We are not here to promote a culture of contentment or complacency. We always admit and accept the fact that there is room for improvement, and I always popularize what George Bernard Shaw used to say, the room is big for improvement. Now, but we have to acknowledge the fact that we have had record highs in job creation and also the best performing stock market in ASEAN. Internationally, our foreign direct investments are historic and our region leading in the areas of semiconductors and data centers. In 2025, here comes a challenge that you must address and deliberate during this forum. We want to double down on our geographical centrality as a conduit for electricity, talent, and supply chain diversification. Specifically, ASEAN Energy Grid, from Laos across to Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, from Sarawak to IKN, Sarawak undersea cable to Semenanjung and to Singapore. It's a fantastic feat in terms of advancing ASEAN, its cohesive force, and in terms of energy grid for ASEAN region. At the same time, we want to refine our expertise in oil and gas, semiconductor, and Islamic finance, so we can be the global market leaders in each field. It's our neutrality, centrality, and openness for partnership that makes us a natural hub for all. Now, economic leadership is about getting the fundamentals right. It's sticking to the prerequisites of high growth, low inflation, and fiscal discipline. Nice mantra, difficult to implement. Low inflation, fiscal discipline. My goodness, in 2 years as finance minister, I realized fiscal discipline is a tough job. Now, as a means to also advocate for the values that undergird our economic structures of equity, energetic populace, and entrepreneurship vigor, this is our values-based growth. Now, finally, we must pioneer through leadership, through dialogue. It is evident that for any civilization to thrive, it must harness and harvest ideas through dialogue, discourse, and debate. Besides its intangible value as intellectual exercise, such engagement strengthens policymaking, making it more robust, comprehensive, and empirically grounded. It gives more sense to the meaning of democratic accountability. That we listen, we engage, we make the necessary adjustments because we do not claim that the government knows best. Unless we are prepared to listen and make the necessary adjustments, admit our flaws, and make the necessary adjustments. This is a tradition not a stranger to us in the East. We have the spirit of musyawara, of gotong royong, and in Islam, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. That we are instructed to consult among ourselves, but once decision is made, then proceed with all the strength and vigor and leave it the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is that consultation, but there's an end. Once decision is made, then we must have that political resolve and the spirit and the commitment to implement to the best of our ability. This is what is required in a country, because continued debate on elementary, unnecessary issues is an important deflection. It's exciting to some people, but it does not resolve the issues that we face and will not ensure our growth and our success to ensure that Malaysia remains an important player in the region. We must get our work in order and work together as a great team of Malaysians from all regions, from all states, from all communities. Jadi rakan-rakan yang saya muliakan, sekali lagi saya ucapkan penghargaan kepada Kementerian Ekonomi karena inisiatif ini yang saya anggap satu yang penting. Kerana kalau kita mau mengangkat martabat ekonomi dan negara kita, kita tidak boleh lengah lagi. Tidak boleh terbawa-bawa untuk bicara hal-hal remeh yang hanya melemahkan kita dan mengancam kekuatan kita. Ini peluang kesempatan terbaik untuk negara ini. Uruskan ekonomi dengan baik, tingkatkan usaha, jalinkan kerjasama, dan fokus dalam kerja masing-masing dengan wacana yang segar, kesediaan membawa perubahan dan penyesuaian, mengaku kelemahan kita, termasuk dalam kerajaan, tetapi untuk membawa perubahan dan kebaikan untuk semua. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih and thank you. May I kindly invite the Honourable Prime Minister to remain on stage for our launch. I'd now like to invite Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli and Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Dato Sri Syamsul Azri Abu Bin Bakar to join the Honourable Prime Minister on stage. On my count. On my count, I'd like to invite the Honourable Prime Minister to please press on the screen for the act of launch. 3, 2, 1. Congratulations. Congratulations on launch of Forum Economy Malaysia 2025. With that, Forum Economy Malaysia is inaugurated as the annual platform to chart Malaysia's priorities and policies for years ahead. I'd now like to invite Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Sri Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Azmi bin Diron, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Zamzam Zairani Muhammad Isa, Madam Carol Fong, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, and Yang Berbahagia Datuk Wan Kamruzaman Wan Ahmad up on stage for a group photo. Thank you once again to the Honourable Prime Minister. I'd like to invite the Honourable Prime Minister and the VIPs to return to their seats. I would like to invite everyone to also join us. We'll be taking a photograph of the VIPs together with the audience. I'd like to invite the VIPs to remain standing and everyone to stand as well for this massive group photo. Thank you. And in just a moment, we'll be taking a short break in plenary hall to be back here at 10:55 a.m. So you can begin a very interesting fireside chat with the Minister of Economy, YB Rafizi Ramli, and that session will be moderated by Yang Berbahagia Datuk Khairul Ramli, the President Group CEO of Maybank. And we would like to announce the departure of the Prime Minister, Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar bin Ibrahim. Thank you for being with us this morning. To be back here at 10:55 a.m.
Keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani.
To be back here at 10:55 a.m. The next fireside chat. Yes, the food, F&B and refreshments is at Plenary Hall 7. Our session, the fireside chat at 11 a.m. will be moderated by Yang Berbahagia Datuk Khairul Ramli, President Group CEO of Maybank. And that will be an interesting chat with the Minister of Economy, Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli. So do be back here at 10:55 a.m. for the session to begin at 11. Once again, refreshments are at Plenary Hall 7.
Peradaban kita bangunkan, bina kota, bina insan, dari budi jadi budaya, bina asas kemampanan, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, semarakkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Peradaban kita bangunkan, bina kota, bina insan, dari budi jadi budaya, bina asas kemampanan, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, semarakkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, semarakkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Peradaban kita bangunkan, bina kota, bina insan, dari budi jadi budaya, bina asas kemampanan, kesejahteraan masa depan. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, bangunkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Ayo seluruh anak pertiwi, semarakkan Malaysia madani, sepenuh hati jiwa semangat, terus meyakini Malaysia madani. Keyakinan jadi ikutan, pendirian jiwa ihsan, nilai hormat keras diminda, daya cipta luar biasa, kesejahteraan masa.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll be starting in a short while. As you're making your way in, there are some seats here up front as well in the second row, so feel free to make your way up front as well. For those of you making your way in, there are some seats up front. Welcome back, everyone. We'll be starting in a short while. There are some seats right here in the front row. The fireside chat with Yang Berbahagia Datuk Khairul Saleh Ramli, President Group CEO of Maybank, together with the Minister of Economy, Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, will be starting in a short while. I'm sure we're all excited to get started on that. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being on time. I hope you'll make your way to your seats very quickly. So Malaysia has successfully moved from agriculture-based to industrialization. What is its next stage of development? How can it realistically shift to become a high-income, creative-based economy from made in Malaysia to made by Malaysia while elevating the country's global brand and influence? Let me now welcome Yang Berbahagia Datuk Khairul Saleh Ramli, the President and Group CEO of Maybank, who will be moderating the session with Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli. Please welcome both the gentlemen up on stage. A round of applause. The stage is yours, Datuk.
Thank you, Frida. Assalamualaikum. Very good morning. Welcome to this fireside chat session. We are very honored to have YB Minister again. Just now, it was one way from him. This time, we have a chance to interact with him. I will probably start with some questions for about 30 minutes. In total, about 50 minutes with him. And then I will open up questions to the floor as well. So, YB, if you look at let me just open up with some big picture first, right? Madani Economy was launched back in July 23. And then after that, there were a few other policies that were introduced, NATA, NIMP, semiconductor policy, etc. We have seen some good outcome, right, and the proof points. You mentioned about IPO, investment has started to be realized. The latest one, of course, is JSSEZ, right? Now, a lot of people's mind is that, is this real? Is it sustainable? And what is the difference now?
Thank you very much, Dato'. I think a lot of you are from the private sector. The proof of the pudding is if you are able to translate all these policy visions into actionable program designs, and we should be able to see this in our GDP numbers and Bursa and so on. The main difference, I think, is the government has moved away from one-size-fits-all, very thick planning. In the private sector, if we were to create value, it's very important to have a vision of where we want to be 4 or 5 years down the line, but then you work on specific growth initiatives. And this is translated all the way, and then you iterate as you go along. You look at how the market reacts to it. I think in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the complexity of our economy was very different, and therefore the stakeholders were very different. And we could survive by just having one big economic plan and then coordinate through the ministry and then just see how things happen. That's why we decided, even from Madani framework, economic Madani, is that there's no point trying to go with a Britannica encyclopedia thick document. Just have a vision and start focusing sector by sector, work with the sector and with the stakeholders, and then translate the action into actions very quickly, because that sense of progress is important. And I think that approach will make a difference to all this.
All right, thanks. We'll go into a bit more specific area. So the first is JSSEZ. So first, congratulations to you for signing that agreement finally with Singapore. We just wanted to find out your thoughts behind the JSSEZ. Again, what's special? What's so special, right? We are told that there are about 140 special economic zones around the world. And what do you think, why do you think this will work, right? And maybe finally is, Singapore is not necessarily the easiest country to negotiate with. Have we committed anything that you can share with us?
Yeah. Well, I think this whole thing about realizing synergies between Singapore and Malaysia, especially Johor, is a common sense that should have prevailed 2-3 decades ago. But, you know, sometimes we have politics in the way, sometimes there was always a mistrust. But I think it's always about each country previously feel that we are in a competition with each other. Time is on our side, and everything seems to, the stars seem to be aligned in the sense that any right-minded leaders in Singapore or in Malaysia acknowledge the fact that given the geopolitical tensions, given the trade wars, we are better off working together to pitch this region to the world. And given the complementary advantages that Singapore can bring to the table and Johor has, it means that if I were an investor, a global investor, and I need to figure out how do I restructure my global operations against this backdrop, I would really love a place where I can have the sophistication of Singapore, given its robust capital markets, funding, ease of doing business, and also the resource that is offered by Johor. And I don't have to choose either one. And more importantly, I think a lot of global companies understand that ASEAN is going to be the 4th largest economy in 10 to 15 years' time. And it's not just a large economy, it is an economy defined by a youthful and digitally savvy population with a large percentage of middle class. This is going to be the next economic powerhouse. And in the same way that in the late 90s and in early 2000, a lot of global investments went into China in anticipation of the consumer demand in China. I think that's going to happen for ASEAN as well. So my plea, of course, to global investors, and this is, I think, what leadership of Singapore and Malaysia subscribe, is that, if you want to have a beachhead for ASEAN 10, 15 years' time, the best place is JSSCZ. You can structure your operations to take into account both, and I think it's going to be a good value offering to the world.
So with that optimism,
yeah.
right? I think I saw in your press statement that you say that now Johor contributes to about 9+% of the GDP of Malaysia. With that kind of optimism with JSSCZ, where will Johor be in terms of the contribution to GDP, say in 5 years down the road?
Well, early estimates now puts JSSCZ's contribution to about $28 billion addition to our GDP every year. So, I mean, the whole area, if it goes as planned, easily will be able to rival Klang Valley, in the next 5-10 years. But during the discussion, and this is the part where Datuk asked, how was it like negotiating with Singapore? We have some Singaporeans here. I have to say this, I think as Malaysians, we should not fear competition. If you go to the negotiating table and you are fair and you have good reasons for wanting certain things to go your way, the chemistry that we built in the beginning actually is the process. It was very difficult, not so much because Singapore was difficult, but this whole concept of, a special economic zone that covers 2 countries is very rare in the world. Most special economic zone is implemented under one jurisdiction. You have those in China, those in Vietnam, right? So for the first time, we have to see how do we operate a single economic unit that is subject to regulations and laws and national policies of 2 countries. So therefore, we have to harmonize a lot of things. Singapore has to harmonize with their respective ministries. We have to harmonize with our respective policies and ministries. And then we have to come together and harmonize the 2 countries. So the process was complex, but it was helped by the fact that I think both the teams on Malaysia and Singapore side understand the value proposition. I think once you focus on value proposition, the give and take will happen. And if this is going to work, our plan at Ministry of Economy is that we need to create a new engine of growth. And of all the areas in Malaysia, the common sense tell you is that if we can leverage on the complementary elements of Johor and Singapore, Johor should be able to be that new engine of growth in the next decade.
Okay. We also saw an announcement about funding from the government, right? On both sides, Singapore and Malaysia, but Singapore, I think, a bit more specific on infrastructure. Would you be able to share with us how much is that coffer and how is that going to be disbursed?
I don't know how many in the auditorium actually goes through the national budget in detail, line by line. Actually, it has already been announced in 2025 budget that an initial sum of 5 billion ringgit is set aside for the infrastructure fund for JSSCZ. Now, I think the sum perhaps is not too much an issue, it's open for debate. Is 5 billion enough or not? What I think we did radically different is this. the traditional method or mechanism to get infrastructure fund from the federal government can be long-winded. I mean, we have representatives from state governments here. You know, it's layer after layer. You have to go through the federal ministries, and then it went through a lot of budget screen before finally it comes to us at the Ministry of Economy. Because of that, the approach in the past has always been on greenfield industrial land. So, you know, if Johor wants to do this, Johor has to say, you know, I fork out money, this is the land, and then I have to bid for federal budget for the next 2, 3, 4 years, and then I build all the infrastructure, and then I will take another 10 years to populate it with investments. By that time, for all you know, Vietnam has beaten us to pulp. So we wanted to change it in the sense that if this were to be done as a private venture, right, you actually do everything investment by investments. We would like to work very closely with investors. You tell us what are you bringing, what do you need, and then we will then very quickly jump the queue and build the infrastructure. And instead of going through that rigorous annual budget screening, we have already set aside 5 billion ringgit for us to draw from that. And then if there is a need in the future, depending on, you know, the interest into GSS, we can always put in more money set aside for the infrastructure charge.
Okay. The other thing is, even before this agreement signed, there's been quite a proliferation of data centers in Johor, right? When we see some comments about data centers, it's just a block of building using a lot of energy and a lot of water, and with little multiplier effect, right? How do you, explain to these people who are pessimists, so to speak?
There's a lot of debate about the value of data center, especially at this current stage of investment into Malaysia. As with everything else in life, there's good and bad. There's opportunities and problems that come with it. It's the same with data center. It guzzles a lot of power and also water, true. At this current stage, the huge investments that we hear of, a lot of the trickle effect basically went to the property sector and the construction, but not really the nitty-gritty of the server rack and everything. We don't have ODM in the country and so on. So there's a lot of imports of these goods now. But Malaysia is expected to be a powerhouse of data centers, not just in this region. If we follow this trajectory, it's going to be a global powerhouse. If you imagine 10, 15 years down the line, we have so many data centers. And as Dr. Chris Miller, I think, alluded this morning, I don't think this is reversible. This is going to be the trend in the future. Data centers is going to be a utility just like electricity, water, and so on. So it's going to expand. Now, in 10, 15 years' time, if we have so many data centers, and data centers will go through its life cycle. You need to replenish the server rack, new ones coming, the ODM has to be there. So there is suddenly an opportunity that can accelerate us leapfrogging the value chain. So to Malaysia, my view is this, we take this demand on our energy and power system as a challenge. If anything, it means that we have to double down to strengthen and build more robustness for our energy sector, precisely because we need this. But if we are able to realize the potential to downstream our semiconductor, and instead of just doing back end, we are hoping that we can start producing made by Malaysia GPUs and chips in the next 5 to 10 years. Then not only we create a new high-value economic sector that serves our own demand, we can then become a global player because other countries will require data centers as well. So that's basically, I think, we take a very long-term view about this whole AI and data centers contribution to our economy.
But related to that, again, is the call on renewable energy, right? So it's not just about being able to supply with energy, but green energy.
Yeah.
You know, there's also talk about supplying green energy to Singapore as well, for example, right? So, and when we look at the supply and demand, we notice that just data centers alone, they will require now, based on what's happening, about 1.6 gig of power. At the same time, you also see that in the next 10 years, coal power plant, about 8 gig will be taken out from the market, right? So there is a need for a new supply, a set of supply. And if you just look at supply and demand, there is a shortfall now. So how fast can we get this to be, you know, implemented?
You know, it's like, I like this reminder that necessity is the mother-in-law of all inventions, you know, and it's even, you know, I mean, you can tolerate your mother, but not your mother-in-law, you know. So I think we've gone through these different stages in our economy, Dato', where we have to face this sudden massive demand. And suddenly, you know, it threatens our system. In fact, that's how the power sector has evolved in this country. You know, the early 90s, because of the sudden surge of demand for electricity, then we had to respond. We had to bring in IPP, and whatever we have now is basically a series of iterations over the last 30 to 40 years, responding to such demand surge. I think we are going through the same thing now, and it's going to be a big strain. That I have to admit. And then when we look at NETA and we project how fast we can install capacities, and as importantly, improve our grid so that our grid can take and harness as much renewable energy as possible. The rate has to double than what we have now, and usually the challenge is the funding. So that's why I think we have to see this huge
funding is ready.
Yeah, demand, precisely. That's why this demand surge is actually good for the economy and good for the system, because the surge comes with money. What we need to do as a government and as private sector is to innovate our market to be able to expedite and realize this money into installed capacities. And that's why I think there has been, you know, good progress in the last 1 year. If you know, NETA was launched in July 2023, you know, within a year, I think, apart from some important policy decisions, allowing exports to Singapore, while it doesn't really make that much difference in terms of the energy balance of Malaysia and Singapore, but it is very important to send the signal to the world that we are open for business. Please bring your money and invest to Malaysia to expand renewable capacities. CRES, I think, was announced almost a year after NETA, and then LSS 5 is about to be finalized. There will be LSS 6. So what we are seeing is this. We have transformed our power industry and grid, access to grid, from one that was closed and based on quota. And so long as we are closed and it was based on quota, it's very difficult to scale up new capacity. To the one that we have now, where it is open, it is accessible, it is market-driven, it allows for willing seller and willing buyer by having willing charges. So this, I think, should be able to allow for renewable capacities to be scaled up much faster than what we have ever seen in the past.
Okay, maybe we just shift gear a bit about the 13 Malaysia plan. You mentioned earlier that you're going to announce it sometime this year. You mentioned that there were 4 mega trends in the 13 Malaysian plan. Apart from what we have seen so far under the Madani economy and all the other policies, can you share a bit of insight in terms what else are you going to introduce in the 13 Malaysia plan?
I think I can give hints at this stage because we've gone through this series of bold and radical initiatives with the Prime Minister. If I had not gone through it, I would say, no, I can't, I'm gagged, you know. So we've gone through a lot of discussions and it is now had been presented to the Prime Minister. We want RMK 13 to be very dramatic and very radical because it is about preparing the foundation and changing the structure that suits Malaysia's next place as a developed nation. So what I can share that too is this. I think what may surprise the public is this. In the past, RMK 5-year plan has always been seen as an economic plan. I remember 20, 30 years back, you know, every time there is a 5-year plan, people will be queuing to try to get the list of projects. And those were the years, you know. And then RMK has always been synonymous with economic plan. The surprise of RMK 13, I think, is a lot less on economy. It's going to be education, upskilling, skill, is all about the talent. Because all these grand plan that we have is just, you know, dreams on paper, unless we make sure that we scale up our education all the way from primary to tertiary, and we make sure that our workforce can leapfrog to suit the kind of demands that we have. So I think it's enough to say that if anything, it should be more exciting to the country because it involves everyone. If in the past RMK is only about, well, at least people think that it's just about economic plans, and therefore only certain type of people, analysts, read in details about RMK, I'm hoping that with the focus on education and talent and skills, it is relevant and applicable to every single Malaysian. But we have to go through that process.
How would you address this particular target, right? So under Ekonomi Madani, there was one target about the share of labor to GDP by 2030 to be 45%. So next RMK will end at 2030. We are probably around what, 33% now?
33%.
And you have an interim target by 2025 this year, or 40%. Are you going to be falling short of that? Looks like
we definitely will miss the RMK 12 compensation to employees target of 40%. I think it's given. The Ekonomi Madani's target is that within 10 years of Ekonomi Madani, compensation to employees ratio, CE target, will be 45%, right? Now, it's still an extremely challenging target, to be frank, but I think we have started the ball rolling, albeit a lot of noises, people like it or don't like it, different sectors will feel differently about it. And a lot of it is a function of, first, basically labor market reforms. We have to accept that, you know, our workforce is not paid enough. I mean, the median salary of about 9 million plus employees that we track when I came into office, the first statistic we released was basically quarterly wage report of formal sector.
median salary is 2,600, which is only about 100 ringgit above basically poverty level, poverty income level, you know. In 2024, a year after that, it's gone up to about 2,750. So as much as it's going to be a big challenge, I think we are on the right track in the sense that the sheer focus on wage increase is going to define and underpin all the other related economic plans that we have. And that's why some people say this whole thing about civil service pay high is political. It's not. The one that is in government's control is civil service pay. And we need to hike it because we need to make sure that we push the salary band higher. I wish that we could do the same with the private sector, but it just doesn't work that way. You know, giving free money to private entities so that they can hike salary doesn't work. So what we do is that we come up with a scheme which is opt-in basis that ties productivity, wage increase, and so on. We call it progressive wage. We have announced minimum wage increase. So I think you can see that progressively in the next 5-7 years, government will continuously intervene and push for salary band to be higher, while at the same time, we push for higher skill job opportunities through the creation of new industries, higher level technology content jobs that we create. The combination of this, I'm hoping that while, only time can tell whether we will hit 45%, but at least it creates the momentum that the trajectory will make sure that we get nearer to 45% within 10 years.
Okay. My last question before I open up to Slido might be related to income actually. So this discussion about M40, B40, T20 is no longer relevant. And it doesn't really reflect the stratification of household, right, income. Now you have got RON 95 subsidy rationalization coming up. The thing is that you're not going to use this stratification. So how are you going to reclassify the population and have that distribution to be given to the right segment of the population?
You see, I mean, this whole B40, M40, and T20 classification is a legacy system that fits the demand of the time and the infrastructure of the time. I think we've adopted it since RMK 10, or I think since RMK 10. Back then, World Bank advocated for this rather simplistic, at least now it is seen to be simplistic, classification of B40, M40, T20, because at that time, that is the best way to classify given the statistic and data infrastructure that we have. Any countries in the world carries out household income and expenditure survey. From there, you will be able to see the income banding. But time has changed. By now, we know just drawing a statistical line is risky when it comes to inclusion and exclusion rates. If you draw the line at 5,000 ringgit, what if you are 5,010 ringgit, but you have about 10 people in your household? So by now, this issue about exclusion and inclusion rates actually become quite pertinent, but we are lucky because at this junction, technology allows us to go granular. We have clouds now, everyone has digital prints, and then all government records, majority of it is actually in digital format. We will be able to go through, to implement a more granular approach to it, to go on unique person-by-person classification, but we need to put the data infrastructure first. And that's the whole hoo-ha about PADU. I mean, if we want to ensure that we are able to migrate from the B40, M40, T20 to a system that is fairer, more granular, and that really targets individual and household, we need that data infrastructure. The good news is that I think more or less we are there, you know, Prime Minister.
So RON 95 subsidy resolution, that data will be ready for RON 95 subsidy
The data, I think, is adequate and ready. The final stage now is to go to Cabinet to officially remove B40, M40, T20 policy and change it to a net disposable income approach that allows us to target more granularly. Most probably that's going to happen very soon because subsidy retargeting has to happen this year. So we need to prepare the eligibility criteria first in time for implementation. So I think we are at the final stage.
So we look forward to that.
Depends, Datuk. Some people do not look forward to that.
So AB, we will then shift to Slido questions.
Yeah.
There are many questions actually. I hope you can give a very short, succinct answer. Yeah? So the first one is that there's been so much focus on Johor. Why not Sarawak? You know, Sarawak has natural resources, largest state in Malaysia, Borneo remains left out.
No, I think we have to play by our strength, you know. So from the national perspective, we have identified clusters of growth to drive the next round of economic growth by the strength of each state. So Sarawak is leading and will continue to receive a lot of high-tech investments, but it's in energy transition. Sarawak is going to, I mean, because Sarawak is able to leverage two things, you know, its vast hydrocarbon resources as well as its vast natural resources that provides hydropower. Likewise, the northern region is going to focus on, you know, the advanced E&E, Klang Valley, you know, digital and tech and service. And the strength of Johor is leveraging on its proximity to Singapore. And the East Coast is on heavy industries because the CCUS, the carbon capture and storage facilities, is planned to be in East Coast.
So
I think
certainly it's not left out.
It's not left out. It's just that we play by each other's strength.
Okay. Next question, how does the government solve the food security issue by adapting Made by Malaysia?
Well, I think this is a very difficult question. You know, there are certain things that we have to produce ourselves. Sometimes it's okay to import, right? But to me, at the very least, we need to hit our self-sufficiency ratio for each of the major produce. And for this to happen, we cannot run our agriculture sector like the 70s and 80s using changkul. Actually, farming and agriculture is a very high-tech industry. And part of the challenges that we have now is basically in terms of machinery, in terms of technology, that does not allow agriculture to be run at the large scale as modern farming. So the shift towards higher content innovation, definitely one of the verticals for such innovation is for modern farming. And having that strength will then crowd in investments, and then I'm hoping that over the years, you know, we can transform our food industry from one that is cottage industry, small scale, to one that is run as an industry. But at the moment, we have this huge gap when it comes to technology and innovation. So this whole thing about Made by Malaysia will also address that.
Okay. Next question, the government, or many governments.
This is really fire start. I don't even have time to breathe. But
that's good, that's good. We still have 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm looking at that 15 minutes ago. Okay.
So the question is, the government has been promoting TVET for many RMKs, right? What has been the ROI?
Actually, I don't know. I don't think we have measured the ROI, to be frank. And that's something that we have to do better. And that's, I think, a challenge in government because, you know, the bureaucracy and everything, a lot of money being spent. But if you're not careful, then we do small scale all over the place. And then while the sum is large, then you just don't have it just doesn't move the needle. So hence, when we talk about RMK 13 just now, Dato', I think that's also one of the key deliverable. We need to make sure that our focus on TVAN actually will be able to translate into the kind of ROI. Certainly there is gap. Hence why in the private sector, people still talk about difficulty in getting the right talents and so on.
Okay. Next question, a bit on diversity. So, can increasing female labor force participation contribute towards boosting the economy? What does the government has in plans to promote that?
Yes, actually, I think we will not be able to meet our economic potential if we don't cross 60% women's labor participation. We are, I think, about what, 56, 57 now, around that. Countries such as Korea and other peers actually has a higher women's labor participation rate of about 64, 65%. So we have a lot of gaps. First, I think the restructuring of the economy will make it more palatable to get more women into workforce for the sole reasons that you will have more female going to universities. That's a trend. That's already the fact, you know. But when our economy gets more complex, it's changing from one that is labor intensive, manufacturing intensive, to one that is innovation-based, service-based, and so on, the kind of jobs it creates will allow for more opportunities for women. And labor market reforms that is happening now is about trying to make sure it is as accommodative to the demand of, you know, female workforce.
I just want to slip one question. This is a bit of interest for me as a banker. We heard during the negotiation with GSS, ISAC, Singapore, etc., that the government is prepared to bring in foreign banks into Malaysia and Johor, right? Are you able to say yes or no?
For the time being, I can state the fact that a lot of things were negotiated, but certainly in the final agreement, beyond what has been announced for Forest Cities Special Financial Zone, JSSEZ does not include anything on banking for the time being. So,
okay, good.
That's in the agreement, that's the fact. I think it's dying to put me on record on that.
Next question from Slido, YB. What's the progress of PADU in assisting the subsidy rationalization?
So, PADU now has data points of 21 million Malaysians. That's about 11 million individual adults, and then with their dependents and so on, so it's about 21 million. That's quite a good number out of about 31 million population. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was very important to get the data ready before we move from B40, M40, T20 to a net disposable income approach. But of course, before we roll it out, we have to reopen PADU so that those who did not register before go in and register. And the discussion in government at the moment is that Ministry of Economy through PADU manages the back end of the implementation. That means that the eligibility of recipient will be decided through the mechanism. Cabinet is going to approve it. The biggest database that government has now is through PADU, and then so it's going to be decided through PADU, and then the recipient list will then be passed to MOF that is going to administer the implementation at the front end with the petrol station. So I think we will hear some announcements in the next few weeks on that.
Next question, YB, probably comes from a much younger population in the crowd. How can Malaysian youth be strategically involved and empowered to become key catalysts in driving the transition, especially from made in Malaysia to made by Malaysia?
You know, I said every time I got asked these questions, usually there'll be a series of social media posts cursing me after that. You know? I think we have to keep up with the demand. For the Gen Z and the millennials, you know, you live in a different era than what Datuk and I grew up with, you know. In the past, for example, right, in the past, we grew up in a situation where working a long, arduous career in one big organization is the way to go. And that's where all of us are here, you know, because they are big and then we grow. The world is changed in such a way that nowadays it's about value creation. And then it's both good and bad, you know, good in the sense that people have different success model, wealth creation model, career attainment model in the future, provided you upskill and you run with the pace of what is happening out there. Startups, innovation drives value now. You don't have to wait until you are 40 years old to become CEO. You can be a CEO at 25. You can go to venture capital and say, this is a good idea, I have this expertise, and then give me money. That was not available during our time, you know. But, okay, this is the part where people usually curse me. It's not easy. Just because 4 or 5 people in the world manage to do it, it doesn't mean that anyone who wants to do it can do it. It takes a lot of grit, it takes a lot of knowledge. You have to be out there and you have to be at the frontier. And therefore, you know, my appeal to the youth of Malaysia, you have to open up, you have to embrace competition, you have to see beyond the constraints. It is not the fault of everyone. If I want to do something, I will take it and run with it. If we can have more and more smart young people thinking like this, then I think our job is done. And that's what we are trying to do with RMK going forward, is to create the environment and ecosystem so that more and more young people from the Gen Z and millennials can create value, but you have to take risks. You are not going to make a millionaire at 30 if you work at Maybank, for example. I don't think so. So it does require a lot of rewiring about how we see the future, our career, and so on. And if we have enough people doing that, Dato', I think then, you know, Gen Z will basically drive this. Before I go to the next thing about Maybank.
Okay, next question, YB. What's the vision on KL-Singapore high-speed rail to bring Klang Valley into the JS-SEZ mix?
I mean, Prime Minister has commented this, I think, when PM Lawrence was here. I think he mentioned it again today. I feel that the role of government is to really focus on enabling the ecosystem and therefore looking to develop public utilities and public goods. Then the question is high-speed rail between KL and Singapore falls into that? Most probably it's not, you know, it's not public goods, because for rail transport, we actually have double tracking completed from Perlis all the way to JB. Government has made a decision to move to leasing rolling stock, so that, you know, our current capacity for rail track is only 30% now because of the limitation of rolling stock. We hope that we can push that beyond 50% by 2030, and therefore for public rail transportation, I think we already have that and government is committed to that. So at the end of the day, this high-speed rail project has to be driven by the private sector, and the determinant is very much the dollars and cents. If it's financially viable, government is not going to stand in the way, but it has to be privately funded. And I think, you know, the race is out there to see who can come up with such a project that can be financially viable as a private project.
Okay. There's a question on impact of migrant workers. How do you see the presence of migrant workers as a possible cause of low wages in Malaysia?
It is. It is. I mean, I know that you know, this is unpopular, especially to a lot of employers. But we are, as an economy, we are addicted to low-wage foreign labor, to the point that even when total cost of employment is actually comparable between low-skilled foreign labor and Malaysians, we are still addicted to it. Actually, for one person now, with the minimum wage, with EPF contribution, with the levy and so on, actually you have to, and then you have to provide accommodation and so many things. Actually, the cost of employing one foreign labor now is easily at least 2,500 ringgit a month, at least. Normally, it goes to even higher than 3,000. The median wage in this country is 2,700 ringgit a month. Graduate entry-level salary is about 3,000, and this is graduate, which is comparable to foreign laborers, but we still want foreign labor. So I think that our push for more complexity in the economy, so that, you know, we create more technology and become innovative, is also contingent on our ability to loosen the dependency on cheap foreign labor. And at least I can speak for myself, unpopular as it is, we are quite determined to do it. And RMK 13 will have a series of policy proposals to expedite the current official quota of foreign laborers of 15%. Now it's 15%. We are hoping that we can drastically push it to a more acceptable level within 5 years and 10 years.
This is probably the last question, but it's a combination of two questions here. It's related to the focus on high-tech industry. On one hand is the players, i.e. how can we promote more SMEs to be more involved in the high-tech side? The other related question is basically how do you then promote private equity, if possible, into this high-tech industry?
Yeah. You know, those two areas mentioned basically are among the most problematic structural defects that we have in our economy. You know, first, we don't have enough PE and VC, and we need to work on our capital mobilization model, because only when we get it right, then we can bring investments into technology. So KL20 last year was part and parcel of it. We are still focusing, and then FEM, for example, is trying to sell that growth narrative idea so that we attract more PE and VC internationally. More investments coming here, more PE and VCs coming. So there's a parallel stream to that. The other stream is about scaling up our SMEs. You know, I don't know in the auditorium whether we are aware that 97% of incorporated business entities in Malaysia are SMEs. There's only about 2% plus large companies. So our economy has become so lopsided that a lot of the burden is put into that small number of large companies, right? So one, that's why, you know, I keep saying that we need to loosen our dependency on cheap foreign laborers, because they are employed mostly also by the SMEs. So long as we stick to the cheap manual labor, there's no incentive and motivation to invest in technology and motivation. And then when you are not exposed to technology and innovation, even if we are successful in in bringing in high-tech investments, it's very difficult to embed our local SMEs into the supply chain. So these things have to happen, simultaneously. Some of it is painful, and I think again it's going to be controversial. I don't know the appetite in the cabinet and in the market, but my view is that we have to bite the bullet, because otherwise we will have all these big investments, but then the gap between our SMEs and the next level of economy is going to get bigger and bigger, and we cannot bring our SME into that kind of supply chain that we want to create.
Okay, thank you, YB. It has been very insightful. It has been very frank. We appreciate that.
I was joking about Maybank.
Okay, we will try to prove you wrong one day. Can we put our hands together to thank
Thank
YB
you.
Rafizi for this frank assessment?
Thank you, YB. Thank you, Dato' Karisale. I'd like both the gentlemen just to stand there for a photograph to make it official. Thank you once again to Dato' and YB. All right, we heard from him this morning, and I'm sure we have more questions as well. We're pleased to have back with us for this dialogue session Dr. Chris Miller, author of Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. And we also have up on stage to moderate the session, Masaru Tsuchiya, partner and leader for the semiconductor practice in Asia, McKinsey & Company, and he'll be moderating the session. I'd like to please a round of applause for both Dr. Miller and also Mr. Masaru Tsuchiya. The floor is yours, Mr. Masaru.
Okay, is mic is on?
Yep.
All right, a lot of pressure after inspirational session by the minister. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the dialogue on the semiconductors. My name is Masaru. I'm a partner in McKinsey's Tokyo office, leading actually our semiconductor practice in Asia. You're welcome to actually call me Masa, because that's the easy name to remember from, I think, Malay speakers, I believe. Masa means time. So it's a perfect timing or time to discuss the semiconductor topic today. So today, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Miller, the acclaimed, I think, author of the Chip War book. This is a renowned, and also he's a renowned expert on the geopolitical dynamics around the semiconductor industry. So in the next actually 15 minutes, we'll explore the intersection of the geopolitics of the semiconductors with a particular focus on what it means for Malaysia. So welcome. So maybe I think before I actually dive into, geopolitical questions, as actually fellow doctoral, myself as a PhD in semiconductor physics, I was curious about your, academic background. You actually have a historian, by training, right? So you're, looking at this industry from fresh eyes, just, curious about what actually inspired you to shift your focus to semiconductor, actually from Russia topic before, right?
Well, first off, thank you for moderating this conversation. I first became interested in semiconductors over a decade ago, and it became clear to me if you wanted to understand the key trends shaping the world today, the shape of globalization, the advance of technology, also the geopolitical rivalries, you couldn't understand any of them without putting semiconductors really at the center of your analysis. And so when I looked out at the world and saw globalization shifting, saw technology advancing, it seemed to me that we spent a lot of time thinking about old industries, the oil industry and its impact on global trade or geopolitics, and not nearly enough time thinking about the industries that were actually going to matter both today and for many decades in the future. And the semiconductor industry is both a driver of this technological progress, also a key factor in shaping how the world economy is structured, and yet until quite recently most people didn't think at all about semiconductors. And so my goal in writing the book was to underscore just how important this industry was in shaping how the rest of the world functions.
I see. And then this is really extensive book. Actually, myself actually using as a pre-read for some of the lecture that I actually occasionally teach at the business school these days. So I think you've done incredible, these, since this is the semiconductor industry, but you've done a lot of actually readings and also a lot of interviews, I believe. So when you're actually doing this kind of, journey of discovery into the semiconductor industry, what were your first impressions? Any particular surprises for you when you do that?
I think a couple of things did surprise me. I think one was the extraordinary complexity of the supply chain, which sounds like an obvious thing to say until you start interviewing people who work in different segments of the supply chain and understand that there's no one who understands how it all fits together. It's just too complex for any individual to understand. The people who are experts in photolithography know very little about packaging, and the people who know how to design chips know little about the chemicals that are used in making them. And that complexity is a good thing in the sense that it's enabled all of this progress, but it also presents a huge challenge for anyone to put the pieces together because there are so many pieces and they are all so complex. So that was the first surprise, was just the level of complexity that undergirded the industry. The second surprise for me was the extent to which every industry that mattered in the world today relies on semiconductors. And I think if you go to people who work in the automotive industry or the medical device industry or the construction equipment industry or the agricultural equipment industry, on their own, they all know there's lots of semiconductors in their products. But the extent to which every category of manufactured good relies more and more on semiconductors to drive value and technological progress, something that was surprising to me just in the number of spheres in which that was happening. And it does seem like one of the key trends in the world economy today is the proliferation of semiconductors across many different types of devices.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, when I also at first actually inspired by semiconductors, it's just starting from sand, right? Polysilicon become actually the computing devices due to GenAI. It's such a huge value added actually into the semiconductor industry, right? So just let me think about this chip war book once again. This was actually published in October 2022, right? So nearly almost like 2 years ago by now. And if I think about last 2 years, a lot of things happened. For example, like ChatGPT release was in November 2022. And I work in the industry in Asia. I've seen substantial actually, boost in domestic chip production from China as well in the last 2 years. So if you look back these last, past 2 years, what are the most significant change you've been seeing in the industry? Anything surprise you or shifted your perspective a little bit?
I think there are two key factors that have impacted really every country and every segment of the chip industry. The first is AI, no doubt. The release of ChatGPT was the culmination of technological developments that had been happening for some time, but I think everyone, including even Sam Altman, was surprised by the way that ChatGPT captured the world's attention, and I think helped people understand just how rapidly AI would be deployed in many different segments of the economy. And we've since November 2022, when ChatGPT was first released, seen a boom in investment in, for example, the data center infrastructure that's necessary for deploying AI tools. And the speed at which that's happened has indeed been a surprise. I think the second key trend has been the intensification of political focus on the semiconductor industry, which is present basically in every major economy that has a stake in the chip industry. You mentioned China, which has been intensifying its investments in chip manufacturing and the rest of the supply chain. The same thing is true in India, which is focused more now than ever on semiconductors. The same is true in the United States, which has of course been subsidizing its own domestic industry as well as trying to control technology transfer. The same is true for Korea and Taiwan and Germany and the Netherlands and Japan and many other countries as well. And that was a trend that had been building over time, but I think the last couple of years has seen that leap forward, driven both by the geopolitical conflicts, which have intensified, but also by the emergence of AI, which has raised the stakes in terms of who has access to the most advanced chips and who does not.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting observation. At the same time, myself feels like this geopolitical angle was quite new to me as well. I've been in the industry for 20 years, but the last like 3-4 years has been intensified quite substantially, right? But if you look at the semiconductor industry, right, look at Morris Chang, who actually founded, I think, TSMC, who is essentially born in China, educated to some degree in the US, and came back almost as an American to Taiwan, right? And if you look at maybe Richard Chan, essentially, he's the founder of the SUMIC, which is like the leading fab in China. He was essentially born in China, but I think almost like educated in Taiwan. Then actually went to US, trained in the US, and coming back to China. So it's international mobility and this kind of brain circulation, making international, I think this industry is strong. Even myself, actually trained in Japan, spent a lot of time in US and got trained, and I now actually, help clients, across the region, right? So just a question, like, with this kind of geopolitical tension comes in a little bit, is it kind of, moving to an era we have a little decouple, like people mobility, supply chain mobility is going to be a little bit stalled a little bit? And do you see the current dynamics, stabilizing at some point as it continue to be decoupling trend?
Well, I think you're right that it is a new change for the industry to have to think seriously about regulatory and geopolitical factors. I think the phrase decoupling is often used in the media, but it doesn't really accurately describe what's happening. There's a couple of different dynamics that I think are key. I think the first is the increasing drive towards self-sufficiency in China, which is happening very, very rapidly with major impacts on the global chip market. China is, of course, the largest consumer of semiconductors every year, and so as it becomes more self-sufficient, not completely there yet, but as it becomes more self-sufficient, the impacts on Japanese companies, Taiwanese companies, US companies is substantial. So that's the first key, I think, trend. I think the second key trend is that among Western companies, there's been a China plus one dynamic, which has encouraged not decoupling, but just shifts in investment patterns. And so in Southeast Asia, there's been a surge of new investment that's been driven by these China plus one dynamics among Western firms. And so again, decoupling doesn't really describe the dynamic very accurately. And I think the third thing is there have been more restrictions on technology transfer as well as on flows of people to some degree. Although I think it's worth noting that the industry is still deeply interconnected internationally, and the restrictions that we've seen have been very narrowly targeted. The US is restricting only certain types of GPU chips, leaving every other type of chip untouched. When it comes to labor mobility, a number of countries, Taiwan, South Korea, to a lesser degree the United States, have taken some steps to limit labor mobility, but there's still a lot of mobility back and forth. And so I'm hesitant to use the word decoupling. I think it's a very broad phrase that misses a lot of the nuance that's happening. And I think if you ask, is the industry deglobalizing? I would say, well, I see no evidence of that whatsoever. I come to Malaysia and I see more investments by foreign firms in Malaysia than ever before. In the United States, there's the largest foreign direct investment in US history as TSMC invests in the United States. And I can give you examples from Japan and from Germany and many other regions as well. So deglobalization also doesn't really accurately describe it, but it's shifting in terms of the patterns, and it's becoming much more politicized than ever before.
I see. So if I use the shifting as a word, really what's happening. But on the other hand, if you look at the industries, I think the trend is that you mentioned about some certain niche, each country has a certain niche they're strong, particular devices. Japan's case, equipment, materials, Malaysia case back-end so far. But essentially, like, what's actually making this intensive amount of capital R&D actually needed, that actually naturally making this kind of winner-takes-all dynamics. So that's the reason why, some sort of like dominance is centralized among few specialized players, right? Essentially TSMC in Taiwan, ASML in lithography, for example, Tokyo Electron having some of the quota developer tools and things like that. So how do you see this kind of dynamics evolving, right? Essentially, like you say, shifting happening. So now I think we have actually just a really dominant player going forward, or do we see essentially multiple winners going forward in certain niche?
I think you're right that the winner-take-all dynamics have been very strong in the industry, driven by the economies of scale that accrue to the leading firms. I think in the 2.5 years since I published Chip War, in some ways those dynamics have even intensified. If you look, for example, at the market share of Taiwan's TSMC in producing the most advanced chips, it's even higher today than it was 3 years ago. And I would say most people in industry don't think that trend is going to change anytime soon. And the fact that there are these vast economies of scale at almost every segment of the supply chain mean that any country that's trying to do it all themselves, anyone trying to achieve self-sufficiency, face enormous barriers because the costs of self-sufficiency are tremendous. And I think that's why when you look across different countries' semiconductor policies, very few are really trying to pursue self-sufficiency just because it is so costly. And even when you look at governments that are spending a lot on subsidizing different parts of their supply chain, in Japan, for example, in the United States, in some European countries, self-sufficiency is not at all the goal. There's diversification of supply chains, there's advances in technology, but none of those governments are pursuing self-sufficiency. I think that the government that's trying the most to become the most self-sufficient is in China, which has also made the most progress in self-sufficiency, just driven by the extraordinary expenditure underway. But even there, I think it's important to note the ways in which China is not self-sufficient. It's, of course, still the largest importer of semiconductors in the world, and even China-based production relies on materials from Japan and tools from the Netherlands and elsewhere. And so even there's a very long pathway towards self-sufficiency that will be measured, I think, in many years, if not decades, which is so difficult precisely because of these winner-take-all dynamics that make competition very difficult.
I agree. And speaking of that supply chain, right, that's essentially self-sufficiency becoming the, the words often used in China and also in the US, I often see in Japan as well these days, right? But on the other hand, if you think about the local supply chain semiconductor, it's impossible. You need to ship silicon wafer from Japan, for example. You need to have photoresist from Europe and Japan, and maybe you need to have a back-end packaging from Malaysia, front-end from TSMC, right? If you think about this trend that's going through local to local, do you think it's going to reshape some sort of the global semiconductor supply chain to some degree? Or, are we going to stabilize maybe China versus non-China? Just what's your perspective on this supply chain dynamics, local to local, is going?
Well, I think local to local can work for certain industries, but not for all industries. So if you look, for example, at the automotive industry, I think there you've seen real pushes by a number of global auto firms to have at least more ability to have local for local if they need it. And that's possible in the automotive industry to a much greater degree than in the AI industry, because those capabilities are more broadly spread, and the level of technology is often slightly below the cutting edge, and so there's more diversity of suppliers there. If you look at the AI industry or the smartphone industry, local for local is not going to happen. Simple as that, and that's because it relies on the most advanced capabilities at multiple nodes in the supply chain, and you just can't localize at any sort of realistic cost. And so in AI, for example, TSMC in Taiwan produces 99% of the world's GPUs. I mean, that is an extraordinary level of concentration. And so if you want to do local for local in GPU production, you have to replicate what they've built now over many decades. It's just a very, very difficult process, and for most countries, it's entirely impossible. So I think local for local will happen in certain segments of industry, but it's not going to happen more generally, especially at the most cutting-edge semiconductor capabilities.
I agree. I think I've seen a lot, like, for example, lagging edge semiconductor. I think it's actually local to local happening to some degree, and then I think the US also have some emphasis recently on the how to actually do the lagging semiconductor, which actually they're importing actually from Asia, right? So that's actually, I agree on that. That's really interesting insights. So maybe shifting a little bit of topic to US, China, and then my obvious, I think the first question everybody wants to ask is, what would be the impact of the Donald Trump actually is going to be inaugurated as a president on January 20th, probably? How do you assess the impact of his second administration? Are there any changes from his first administration, for example?
Well, I think Trump will represent changes in a lot of ways from the Biden administration, but I actually think on semiconductor issues there will be less change than in most other spheres of policy. And the reason for that is that in the United States, there's a consensus among both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, around the key issues related to semiconductors. There's bipartisan support for domestic manufacturing. The CHIPS Act was passed by Congress with both Democrat and Republican votes. There's bipartisan support for the policy of trying to restrict technology transfer to China. Trump started that, Biden continued it. I think Trump will continue it further. There's bipartisan support for taking trade measures against China. Trump, of course, famously increased tariffs on China, but tariffs are even higher now after 4 years of the Biden administration than they were at the start of the Biden administration. And so Trump will impose more tariffs still, I think, but that will be part of a trend line rather than a major change. I think the trade space is where we're likely to have more change. Under Biden, there were increases in tariffs in certain sectors, but I do think that Trump has signaled he wants broader-based tariffs and is willing to be a bit more disruptive economically to achieve his trade goals relative to what the Biden administration will see. And I think as a result, trade is an interesting area to track closely. And of course, it has a lot of impact on the chip industry. We saw electronic supply chains shift in pretty substantial ways in response to the first round of tariffs that Trump imposed in 2018 and 2019. And I think if we see comparable tariffs again, that will induce further supply chain shifts.
I see. But I think on semiconductor, a substantial amount of consistency across the administration, which is actually interesting to hear. I mean, speaking a little bit of China, right? So China, I think, shifting is happening, not decoupling to some degree. But on the other hand, I hear a lot from Western executives and also Japanese executives. So I think for these, manufacturers or semiconductor manufacturers as well, China is often the time one of the biggest market for them, right? And recently, if you think about because self-sufficiency push, substantial amount of high quality semiconductor, material suppliers, even some of the device manufacturers are emerging. So how, are these Western companies navigating this increase in complexity dynamics operating in this market? Particularly, how do you think Western market, companies should see this China market going forward?
Well, I think the semiconductor industry doesn't have a unified view on this question because different types of firms have different levels of exposure to the Chinese market and different levels of competition as well. For the firms that are essentially monopolies, that have no competition worldwide, that have benefited from winner-take-all dynamics and have no real Chinese competition, for them, China is just a vast market, and so they want as much openness as possible. But there are other firms that have competition from China and are seeing their market share decline as Chinese capacity to produce, especially lagging-edge chips, grows. And for firms in this position, China is still a market, but it's not a growing market. It's often a shrinking market because of competition from Chinese firms. And I think this second category of firms is much more open to increased trade and regulatory burdens being imposed because they're looking at their market share declining in China. Sometimes they're seeing market share decline in Southeast Asia, and they're worried about market share decline in their home markets as well. And so I think this is a segment of industry that has a very different view than the segment that only sees China as a market and doesn't really face any sort of real competition.
So it depends on which industry, what segments you're looking at as well, right? So, and the one thing, I actually manage batteries essentially, and also the semiconductor. So one thing I think what happened in the battery industry is that probably 2016 to 20 in particular, in the last 3 years as well, the substantial actually amount of capex investment happened essentially in the battery capex in China. So if you look at the supply, demand balance, right now essentially supply is almost double the amount of probably local demand right now. So it's in these batteries actually flowing to Europe, and then all the discussions are happening on this EV tariff and things like that. And then I've seen a little bit of, if you look at the equipment manufacturers revenue these days, Lam, maybe Applied Materials and Tokyo Electrons, nearly 50% of equipment sales in China. So I'm seeing substantial, I think, the capex flowing to China, right? So do you foresee similar trajectory like battery, essentially, particularly lagging node and some of the, I would say, simpler technology, I would say? And semiconductors are complex, so nothing is really simple, but simpler technology would be seeing similar trend like batteries, or you don't see that kind of trend happening?
I think that is a risk. I think a lot of or I would say a share of the tool purchases that have been made by Chinese firms over the past couple of years is not about current demand, it's about stockpiling. And although the companies in question often don't like to talk about this, the reality is that Chinese firms are looking at restrictions that exist. They want to get ahead of them, and so they're buying equipment to stockpile. And so not all of the equipment that's being purchased will feed into immediate demand, I don't think, which is important to note. But I think you're right to suggest that the scale of the government support for building out chip manufacturing in China is highly significant. It's led to a boom in the production of chip-making facilities in China, and this is already having an impact on the global chip market. I think it's less likely to produce overcapacity because I think the rest of the world's chip firms are responding by investing less than they otherwise would. And we've seen a number of instances in the US, for example, where companies have been pressured by their own investors to invest less on the grounds that if they invest, they'll face more competition from low-cost producers in China, and therefore they're not going to invest as much. And so I think actually the fact that non-Chinese firms are highly market-driven will limit overcapacity risks. Now, the flip side is that if you're a government in Japan, in the US, in Europe, in Taiwan, and you're watching your companies invest less, that's something that doesn't look like a particularly attractive outcome. And I think we're going to see over the next couple of years, all of the governments that I mentioned right there introduce more restrictive measures on the use of Chinese-made chips in their supply chains as part of an effort to spur their own firms to keep investing so that their market share doesn't decline.
I see. Interesting. But the share implication is quite substantial, right? Okay, I agree. So maybe I think I'll have one more question on China and then move into actually Malaysia questions. But one last thing I just want to talk about China is actually, despite numerous efforts, I think still China lacks this leading edge technology, and TSMC sharing this like almost 90% of share in the leading edge is actually something you extensively wrote in this book as well, right? So what is the likelihood essentially China will essentially catch up in the, I would say Taiwan, in this topic, and what are essentially like factors development essentially needed to catch up?
I think the challenge for advanced chip manufacturing in China is not just that China has to catch up with Taiwan, but actually that China has to catch up with Taiwan and Japan and the US and the Netherlands simultaneously, because it's all of those countries working together to produce the capabilities that make advanced chip manufacturing in Taiwan possible. That's what China now has to do. And because of the restrictions that the US, Japan, and the Netherlands have put in place, you can't access the most advanced tools in China. And so China's in the process of trying to replicate what's literally the most complex and expensive supply chain humans have ever created, bar none. And so it's a hard task. It's not easy, which is why despite that there are a very large number of very smart engineers working on this problem in China, the reality is that the leading Chinese firm, SMIC, which produces processor chips, is, if anything, slightly further behind TSMC today than it was a couple of years ago. Every year, SMIC makes advances. Every year, TSMC makes advances. And so the gap between them has been roughly 5 years for the last 15 years. And catching up is very, very hard to do. People often ask me, when will China catch up? And I say, well, the rest of the world has fallen behind. You used to have advanced chip making in Japan, in the US, in Korea, which has fallen behind, Taiwan, in Europe. But Taiwan has pulled ahead in this segment. And you used to have advanced lithography tools produced in Japan and the US and the Netherlands, but the Netherlands has pulled ahead in that segment. And so the trend has been this winner-take-all dynamic. And so the assumption, I think, shouldn't actually be catch up, because catching up has not been happening. It's been the rest of the world falling behind the leader in each segment of the supply chain, which illustrates, I think, just how hard it will be to indigenize the entire supply chain in China.
Yeah, interesting. And also surprising fact about this, like TSMC, the leading edge, is the demand is humongous. If you look at the demand-supply gap, it's actually substantially increasing these days, right? So 2-nanometer nodes and things like that. And a lot of actually AI chip companies are complaining, like, we don't have the capacities, and that's actually been their market share. So it's an interesting dynamics. We'll see. Respect TSMC's ability actually substantially to lead that, right? So given almost like half the time that from the 15-minute section, we have about 25 minutes. I just want to spend the rest of the time a bit more talking about Malaysia, right? The first question that I have is, in the plenary, you actually had a sentence: neutrality is a challenge in a strategic industry. I thought it was kind of interesting comment that you had. In Malaysia and also ASEAN has been really placing like I think not the best, but I think it has been playing as a neutral country in this shifting, I would say, geopolitical dynamics, right? So essentially, does this neutral strategy work? Essentially, first of all, and then what are essentially the challenges and opportunity eventually Malaysia has in this kind of neutral context?
Well, I think the opportunities are certainly clear, which is that you can have investment from a whole variety of different countries in Malaysia, and it's seen as a neutral ground in some ways. And the investment boom in the semiconductor space that Malaysia has benefited over the last couple of years is driven partly by that fact, as well as the strength of the ecosystem. So that's the plus side. I think the challenge is that both China and the United States have increasingly adopted measures to be more intrusive in supply chains. We've seen this with the US, for example, regulating how US chip-making tools can be used even if they're installed in Taiwan. We see this with China right now, increasingly regulating if you import a critical mineral from China, where can you then export it to? And I think this trend of focusing on supply chains and involving politics more in supply chain decisions, even when the supply chains themselves are located in a third country, this is a trend that has got a long way to run. And it means that neutrality is going to be difficult to maintain because multiple countries will be trying to influence the shape of the supply chain and use the fact that their companies or their materials or their technologies are present to exert different forms of political leverage, which doesn't mean that neutrality is not a sensible strategy for Malaysia. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it does mean, I think, that there are real challenges to think through in terms of what does it actually mean to be neutral, and what are the choices one will have to make when China on the one hand and the US have different views and are pushing not just politely and diplomatically, but also using their supply chain leverage to try to get their view implemented. And I think what we see is, final point, as supply chains get more complex, the likelihood that any given supply chain relies both on the US and on China increases. And so complexity actually enables this type of supply chain competition.
And then anything like maybe can Malaysia or maybe neutral country can do really do the neutral, like more like a zoning differences or maybe restriction on certain things, or anything in particular you feel to keep the neutrality? Or?
Well, I think the segments of supply chains that will be politicized in the future are hard to predict today. It's just very hard to predict what will be the focus of political leaders in either China or the United States in 3 years' time, or in 5 years' time, or in 10 years' time. And so I think rather than any specific toolkit to hedge against the politicization of supply chains, I think the key is to be cognizant and regularly tracking how both China and the United States are approaching this issue. I think it's often the case that Chinese and US policymakers themselves are surprised by the issues that come into focus. I'll just give you an example. Drones are a technology that are predominantly used for civilian purposes. Most drones that are created go into civilian hands for photography and for individuals to use. But it's also become clear in the Russia-Ukraine war the extent to which they also have military relevance. And every civilian drone manufacturer in the world, I think, is now facing intense pressure to ask questions about what are the components in their supply chain, where do they produce, who do they sell to, in ways that companies that thought of themselves until very recently as only in the civilian sector are realizing that governments no longer think they're only in the civilian sector. Governments think they have other applications as well. And so companies just must be diligent in tracking these trends and nimble when they have to respond.
Interesting. So maybe switching topic a little bit from actually the neutrality topic to national semiconductor strategy, which highlights essentially Malaysia tried to actually upgrade the supply chain from essentially moving up the value chain essentially to advanced packaging, IC design, eventually to advanced node manufacturing. I think we talk a lot about this thing, advanced node manufacturing with TSMC example. We haven't talked much about this IC design and advanced packaging. And if you think about Malaysia's strategy now, I think they actually have the biggest IC design park, having ARM, for example, Cadence, Phison, which is a SSD, I think, design manufacturers, and also Intel invests in Penang, right, for advanced packaging. So how do you see this IC design and advanced packaging in this global, semiconductor value chain? And then, what are essentially like a strategic step should Malaysia take, essentially, to establish itself as a leader in these two topics?
I think to start with chip design, I think there's a long-running trend that is driven by the increasing complexity of manufacturing, which is pushing companies to lean more heavily on chip design to drive technological progress, which means that we will need even more chip designers in 10-year time than we have today. And it also, I think, suggests that more types of companies will be involved in the chip design process. So we already, for example, see the big technology companies, data center operators, designing their own chips in-house. I think automotive is a sphere where we're increasingly seeing focus on systemic thinking about how do the choices you make about which chip to use impact your overall electronic system. As we have better robotic systems, and there's a lot of investment right now in robotics, that will, I think, often involve, if not specialized chip design, at least very careful systems level thinking about how chip choices interact with software choices. And so I think this presents a lot of opportunities for Southeast Asia in general and Malaysia in particular to build on the existing expertise in chip design that you mentioned and take advantage of the fact that there will need to be much more of that in the future. So I think there's plenty of growth to go around in both chip design and in systems level engineering, including thinking hard about the role of semiconductors and systems. On packaging, I think there's also lots of opportunity in advanced packaging. Every semiconductor company talks about advanced packaging as a priority area. And again, as we face ongoing challenges in shrinking components smaller and smaller on chips, there's more focus on packaging in creative ways to drive performance improvements. And this is making packaging more capital intensive, more R&D intensive, more value creation coming from the packaging process. And I think there's an obvious opportunity here for Malaysia, which is one of the world's leaders in packaging and the ecosystem. But I also think there are challenges here. As packaging gets more capital intensive, more countries have a cost-effective way of participating. And so in addition to countries that are current big players in packaging like Malaysia, you also hear advanced economies talking about trying to play a bigger role in advanced packaging on the grounds that because it's capital intensive and not labor intensive, cost structures are much more viable in advanced economies than previously. And so whether it's Japan, the United States, to a lesser degree Europe, there's focus on advanced packaging there too. And so I think the advanced packaging landscape will be quite competitive, though certainly Malaysia has a very strong base to build from.
Yeah, I agree. And then this, I think, the long history Malaysia has in the semiconductor ecosystem is, I think, the strength. I believe the country has been working on semicon since like 70s, have like 50 years plus of the experience in doing so. But having said that, even among the ASEAN nations, right, I think other countries are becoming quite interested in this topic. So, what are your advice or strategic step I think should Malaysia take to take its leadership position in the semiconductor manufacturing, particularly even including back-end space as well? How can Malaysia sustain this leadership?
Well, I think you're right that across Southeast Asia, semiconductors are a focus in nearly every major economy. But I do think that perhaps alongside Singapore, Malaysia has the most developed ecosystem by a substantial margin. And so the steps that are being taken by other countries in the region, like Vietnam, are at an earlier stage in the development process than Malaysia has done. They've done that many years ago. And so that means that there's actually, I think, less competition between ASEAN countries than one might expect. They're focused on the same industry, but different segments of the industry. And so that's, I think, good news for ASEAN-level cooperation on semiconductors. I also think the fact that the industry is going to grow so rapidly over the coming years, easily be $1 trillion industry by the end of the decade and perhaps above $1 trillion, means that, again, there's plenty of growth to go around. And I think talking to companies, both in the region and companies that invest in the region, there's a recognition that there are talent constraints in nearly every country. And when I'm struck talking to industry leaders and CEOs, wherever you go in the world, you ask, what's your number one problem? Everyone says talent, which means that I think, will there be competition between countries over talent? To some degree, but I think actually the key competition is between companies that can't access all the talent they need. And that also, I think, is a scope for ASEAN-level cooperation in upskilling and making sure that the talent is here that companies both in the region and foreign companies that are investing are looking for.
I see, and I agree. Talent is actually a really huge challenge, and I'm doing this year. I think I have last year I had multiple engagements on that actually on the talent. So all of a sudden become a huge topic, even for the leading players. It was surprising, right? And also a good segue to my next question. I think if you look at actually Malaysia versus Taiwan versus Korea, right? I think you wrote in the book as well. All countries, including Hong Kong, Singapore, was very similar in the 1970s. But if you think about South Korea, essentially, Samsung essentially made a huge, I think, funds into the semiconductor that actually took away, I think, the share from Japan in the DRAM. And also Taiwan, in essentially, I think 1985, I think Maurice Chan actually became head of the ITRI, Industrial Technology Research Institute, and actually founded TSMC in 87, I believe. And then 90s, I think, in Taiwan grew substantially, took the shares, and this fabulous model emerged, right? So, I believe this is probably once in a century opportunity for Malaysia to, I think, upgrade this capability in semiconductor. On the other hand, what are the essential lessons we can learn from this? I think the Malaysia, Taiwan, Korea, same stage in 70s, and then they did well. And then what are essentially critical factors that then do Malaysia need to change this time in order to actually be successful?
I think it's a hard question and an important question. One of the, I think, historical analogies that I like to look at is in 1987, TSMC was founded in Taiwan, and Chartered Semiconductors was founded in Singapore. And of course, the Singaporean government is very talented at many things, but this was an area where, despite, I think, a sensible strategy, that investment did not work out, whereas TSMC did. And I think that illustrates just the extraordinary difficulty in this industry. Even if you've got the right strategy, if you don't have the right people and the right product and the right particular tactics, it's often very challenging to win the race. And that, I think, speaks to the challenges that every country has as they kind of develop their semiconductor strategies. I think what Taiwan and Korea have done very well are, first off, especially in Korea, thinking not only about semiconductors, but also about the products that they go into. And if you have the products, you help create some of the demand for the components that drive growth. And so that's, I think, the first thing I think for ASEAN in general, but Malaysia as well, to think about. Are there categories where you can have Malaysian products, Malaysian brands that will in turn drive demand for the component level production? Because that's a very clear way to move up the value chain. Not easy at all. In fact, extraordinarily difficult, but that is one pathway. I think for Taiwan, of course, they haven't really taken that pathway. It's been different. Taiwan has done very well, both in terms of creating the conditions for TSMC to become a market leader by focusing on solving every single challenge that TSMC confronted, making sure they had access to exactly the talent that they needed via ITRI and other efforts to train and upskill the population, but also by making sure they were as deeply integrated into international supply chains as possible, because TSMC grew alongside the fabless firms like Apple and Qualcomm that purchased chips from it. I think the second thing that Taiwan has done well was shifting from the manufacturing to the design side very early. And if you ask yourself, what are the world's leading chip design firms? What you find is that they're basically all based in the US or China. And Taiwan is, I think, arguably the third-placed player with MediaTek in particular, but also many medium-sized firms playing significant roles. And that's something that most other countries have really struggled to do. And so I think focusing on chip design, I think political leaders often prefer to focus on big factories. Certainly in the United States, political leaders always love a good photo opportunity in front of a factory. Chip design seems less attractive, I think, often, but it's in fact where much of the value accrues. And so I generally find that in engaging with governments, there's insufficient focus on chip design relative to the more manufacturing heavy elements of the supply chain.
I see, interesting. And also, I think your analogy of this Taiwan, I think Korea was kind of interesting. I think demand creation is kind of a huge lever. Even if you think about actually some of the TSMC going to Germany, Japan, and also I think the US, I think the customers are there really demanding them to be localized, right? And speaking of that, if I remember this morning session, I think I realized ASEAN is actually fourth biggest, I think, GDP in terms of combined GDP. So this region has the demand. This region is actually growing, right? So in terms of that, I personally believe that there's something we can do really as ASEAN-wide as well. And given that Malaysia will chair, or is actually chairing ASEAN 2025, well, actually would you offer like ASEAN nation to strengthen in the semiconductor ecosystem? Are there any cooperation opportunity among them? Or any advice to essentially ASEAN nations on the semicon?
Well, I think the first place to look is at the business environment. The second place to look is at talent, I think. We've seen, I think, really substantial steps within ASEAN, both over the last couple of years, but also recently between Malaysia and Singapore efforts to further streamline the business environment to facilitate supply chain operation. And in this industry, that's absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And I think any effort focused on making it easier to move goods across borders to facilitate that dynamic is seen by the industry as necessary for additional investments. I think talent is the second key area to focus on. Obviously, every government will have their own talent strategy, but it does seem to me that ASEAN-wide there are some shared challenges, and finding ways to jointly solve those is something that would both make sense, I think, for ASEAN countries, but also for the companies that they're trying to provide talent to, which are looking across ASEAN, different countries to address different facets of their talent challenges. And I think there are many companies in the semiconductor space that already have offices in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Vietnam, and elsewhere, who are already thinking across ASEAN in terms of their talent pool. And so there might be scope for ASEAN-level talent policies as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you think, even like investment is one thing, but talent actually plays a substantial role in semiconductor. It's actually like, if you look at TSMC's executive, like almost 60%, 70% PhDs, right? And there are a lot of top executives that are in trained top schools and really migrated. If you think about Samsung's the emergence in Korea, you were writing the book as well, a lot of actually Koreans trained in the US university in semicons and moved the technology there. So I think if ASEAN become a talent powerhouse, I think the region has a substantial and also sustainable actually growth in the semiconductor, in my opinion as well. So speaking, stepping away a little bit from I think the ASEAN, but we are also competing with other regions as well, like India. They're having this, India semiconductor mission, $10 billion investment. And anytime I talk to the semiconductor executive, I think India is great because I think, well, infrastructure isn't there, but subsidies amount are substantial, like, half, coming from the government and additional from the state as well. And the recently I've been seeing actually Middle East became quite interesting semiconductor somehow actually. Saudi's 2030 vision has a semicon. UAE's Tech Initiative also have a semiconductor as well. And if you think about Abu Dhabi's Mubadala has been investing in global foundry, they also have good understanding in the industry as well. So how do you see these kind of, region influencing actually the semiconductor market? And what are the implications to ASEAN?
I think each of these regions has different assets. I think in the Middle East, the asset is the scale of capital that can be deployed very rapidly, and I think we've seen both Saudi and the UAE be very ambitious in their desire to build an industry, and they have many assets, but the primary asset is the ability to deploy lots of capital very, very rapidly. I think in India, there's an effort to build an industry from a relatively limited base to start, at least on the manufacturing side. On the design side, India has substantial capabilities. I think many of the participants in the Indian market are focused above all on leveraging India's domestic market, which as a single country is quite large and growing very rapidly. And I think that's a lot of the focus in the Indian ecosystem is on building more of an India-focused ecosystem, leveraging India's domestic demand. And I think there's, just given the scale of the Indian market, there's a real logic there. I think the advantage that that certain Southeast Asian countries, especially Malaysia, has is the ecosystem that already exists, which is far ahead of what exists in India and far ahead of what exists in the Middle East, where there's almost nothing right now. And so that existing ecosystem is an extraordinary asset. Of course, it doesn't guarantee anything for the future, but it does give you a position from which to build. And I think if you talk to global semiconductor firms, they understand exactly what it means to invest in Malaysia because they've already done it. Whereas when they look at India or look at the Middle East, there is opportunity but also uncertainty because they haven't invested there before. And the existing relationships and the trust that international companies already have in Malaysia from decades of experience is, I think, an asset that's not to be underestimated.
I agree. I think already having existing solid talent in the nation is a substantial advantage, I think, for Malaysia. And also, I think, maybe collaboration with Singapore is actually emerging with Johor, Singapore, and things like that. I think it's going to strengthen that, I think, the ecosystem, I believe. So it's a, I think, good and bright future for Malaysia, I believe. So maybe I think given that we have 5 minutes to go, start actually closing things. But, we tend to actually focus a little bit near term, like, how to compete with India, sometimes compete with, like, Middle East, US, and China. But sometimes, if you think about the nation's strategy, we need a long-term view as well, right? So if you think about like 2040, 15 years from now, or like maybe 2050, 25 years from now, how do you kind of envision the semiconductor industry evolving? Like, and what are the challenges and opportunity that might actually define its trajectory essentially to 2040 and 50?
Well, it's very difficult to look 25 years out. That's a good, challenging question to conclude our conversation on. I think we can say with some degree of confidence that if you look at the history of technology, there's been waves of products. There were mainframe computers in the 60s and 70s, and the rise of the personal computer in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, then the smartphone and mobile computing all the way up to the present, and now we're at the start of a new wave that I think will be at least a decade-long wave and probably more with the application of artificial intelligence. I think we don't yet know what will be the killer app for AI. I think the chatbots that we can play with online, like ChatGPT, are not going to be the end state of the application of artificial intelligence. And I think we're just in the early stages of seeing the new products that will emerge, both for enterprises to become more efficient and also for consumers that will harness artificial intelligence. But I guess I'd feel pretty comfortable saying we're at the start of a long-term wave. And if you ask yourself, well, what will it mean to deploy more artificial intelligence in all aspects of the economy and all aspects of human life, I think it will mean more computing, it'll mean more memory, it'll mean more sensors, it'll mean more autonomy, more autonomous systems. And that means for the semiconductor industry, growth across all of those different spheres. The last couple of years since ChatGPT, there's been extraordinary focus on the GPU chips that enable artificial intelligence, the data centers that they're trained on. But I think that's probably, again, just the first stage. And in the long run, we'll be doing just as much computing on the edge of networks rather than in the center of them, which will require different types of chips. So the basic trend of more computing power will, I think, persist for a long time, and that will be a long-term growth driver for this industry.
I see. Yeah. One thing fascinating about the semiconductor industry is like I am, trained by engineer. Anytime I've seen this like nanometer transistors, I thought crazy. But then somebody actually created demand all the time, like ChatGPT, something I couldn't imagine like 15 years ago. But the demand is there. At the same time, I think within like 10 years or 15 years, I think leaders is going to change. I think in Japan is a good example. In the 1980s, we were the leaders. Then I think the South Korea progressed fast. I think the Japan in 96 or 7, right? I forgot actually the year, but almost 6-7 years. And the battery, I've seen a similar trend in the last 15 years. In 2010, Panasonic, these companies are leaders. Now CATL is having substantial, I think this share. And then their market cap is probably like almost 4 or 5 times of Panasonic for absorb that in Sanyo. So I think if Malaysia become very serious about actually, taking, step into this, industry, I believe, 10 years, 15 years is, a reasonable time to really think about becoming significant in the industry, I believe. So I'm actually approaching to the end of our time, so it's time to, almost close the time of the session. But any final thoughts or the comments before we close the session to the audience?
Well, I would just end by concurring with your argument that in fact, if we're at the early stage of a new wave, there's more opportunity than in the middle or the end of a wave. If you look at the smartphone wave, what you find is that was one of the key factors that put Taiwan at the absolute epicenter of the chip industry, because the entire chip industry that was supplying smartphones depended on Taiwan for production. If you go back to the prior wave of personal computers, that was when on the chip side, Intel, and on the software side, Microsoft became absolutely central companies, not just to the tech sector, but to the entire world economy. And so I think right now we do have that uncertainty about which firms and which technologies and which countries will play different roles in the industry. And that makes it a very exciting time to be watching the semiconductor industry. There's great progress, but also I think a tremendous flux in the industry that will play out over the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also truly believe one more time that Malaysia has a golden opportunity to shape this, future of the industry. Thank you very much for all being part of this important dialogue. I know actually this session stands actually between you and the lunch break. So, and also myself, I start becoming a little hungry. So actually, with that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Miller. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miller and Masaru-san. Gentlemen, I'd like you up front here for a photo. A couple of announcements. Lunch will be held at Hall 7, Level 3. The afternoon session begins at 2 p.m. at Halls 6A and 6C, so do make your way back by 1:55 p.m. The afternoon session in Hall 6A will be discussing fiscal and monetary policies, focusing on strategies with the Minister of Finance 2, YB Senator Dato Sri Amir Hamzah Azizan, the Governor of Bank Negara, Dato Sri Sheikh Abdul Rashid Abdul Ghaffur, and Ms. Yeo Eng Ping, Asia Pacific Tax Leader from EY. Concurrently at Hall C, the topic will be ASEAN Dynamism, where we'll be focusing on capitalizing on opportunities and navigating transactions with the Minister of Defense, YB Dato Sri Muhammad Khalid Nordin, Assistant Professor, National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, Japan, Dr. Guani Lim, Senior Fellow, Asia Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Alina Noor, and CEO of Bursa Malaysia, Dr. Umar Swift. So do enjoy your lunch. Again, that will be at Hall 7, Level 3, and be back by 1:55 p.m. so we can start at 2 p.m. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.